Well, turning now to new data released by Statistics Canada, indicating that Canadian travel to the U.S. continues to decline.
Welcome back. A new survey showing a majority of Canadians think that boycotting American-made goods or travel to the U.S. is helpful. According to a new Nanos research poll, 4 out of 5 Canadians say that boycotting American-made stuff or avoiding tourism to the United States altogether will strengthen our country's bargaining position in the ongoing trade war launched by President Trump.
Canada made a quiet move that is hurting the United States without passing a single new law. Canadians simply stopped crossing the border, keeping their money at home instead. Canada stands to benefit from stronger local spending, while many American businesses are feeling the pain. Canadian resident return trips from the United States fell by roughly 25% in 2025, millions fewer border crossings compared to the year before. Hotels along the northern U.S. border are reporting significant revenue losses. Tour operators, duty-free shops, and attractions that built their business models around Canadian visitor spending are reducing staff and cutting operating hours. And no government policy in Washington forced any of it. No trade tribunal ordered it. No diplomatic agreement required it. Millions of individual Canadians simply decided to stop going. The 2025 to 2026 Canadian boycott of the United States is documented across multiple economic sectors simultaneously: travel, alcohol, consumer goods, and retail, making it distinct from any previous episode of consumer-driven trade response in the modern bilateral relationship. Earlier waves of Canadian consumer sentiment against American goods had been partial and short-lived. This one has been comprehensive, sustained, and accelerating. The Wikipedia documentation of the boycott identifies it as beginning in earnest in early 2025, following the Trump administration's tariff announcements, and extending through 2026 without the consumer. Behavior reversal that American hospitality businesses had hoped would arrive once the initial anger passed. The travel component is where the economic damage is most immediately measurable. Canada is the United States' largest source of international visitors. Canadians cross the border for shopping, leisure, medical care, family visits, and short break vacations at a scale that makes them a foundational segment of the customer base for hotels, restaurants, and attractions across a band of American states extending from Maine to Washington. The Washington Post reported in April 2025 that the decline in Canadian travel to the United States had become sufficiently severe that American tourism operators were directly connecting it to changed consumer sentiment, rather than to exchange rate movements or other conventional demand factors. A 25% drop in Canadian resident return trips from the United States represents a massive withdrawal of spending from communities that had built infrastructure around that spending over decades. The geographic concentration of the impact makes it more severe at the local level than the national aggregate suggests. Northern border states New York, Vermont, Michigan, Minnesota, Washington, and Maine rely disproportionately on Canadian visitors compared to states further south. Niagara Falls, New York, Burlington, Vermont, Detroit's tourism district, the San Juan Islands in Washington state. These are locations where Canadian day trippers and weekend visitors represent a substantial share of total visitor traffic in normal years. A 25% decline in Canadian visits is not distributed evenly across America's travel economy. It lands hardest on the communities closest to the border that have been most dependent on Canadian consumer spending for the longest time. The alcohol dimension of the boycott demonstrates how quickly a government-directed commercial action can convert into consumer behavior that outlasts the original policy trigger. Provincial liquor boards in Ontario, British Columbia, Quebec, and other provinces removed American spirits, wine, and beer from shelves beginning in early 2025. The LCBO, which operates the largest government retail alcohol monopoly in the world by revenue, removed more than 3,600 American products from its shelves, representing annual sales of approximately $965 million in U.S. wine, beer, spirits, and seltzers. When those American products disappeared, Canadian consumers discovered domestic alternatives. And significant numbers of them stayed with those alternatives even as some provinces began allowing certain American products back in limited form. Brown-Forman, the Louisville, Kentucky company that produces Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey, among the most recognized American spirits brands globally, missed quarterly sales estimates and reported muted spirits demand in its March 2025 results, with Canadian market disruption specifically identified as a contributing factor. CEO Lawson Whiting described the LCBO's shelf removal as worse than a tariff because it eliminated sales entirely rather than simply making the product more expensive. A 25% tariff reduces margin. A shelf removal removes the product from the market entirely for the period it remains in effect. For a company whose Canadian export revenue depends entirely on placement in government-controlled retail infrastructure with no private sector alternative, the distinction carries the full difference between reduced profitability and zero revenue. The American distilled spirits industry's broader exposure to the Canadian and European boycott was documented by the Associated Press. American spirits exporters faced coordinated market access restrictions across multiple major export destinations simultaneously. Canada through the provincial liquor board removals, and the European Union through retaliatory tariff measures the EU applied to American bourbon and other distilled spirits in response to American steel and aluminum tariffs. The EU's retaliatory measures on American spirits are a different legal instrument from Canada's liquor board decisions, but the commercial effect runs in the same direction. Reduced American spirits market access in two of the largest international markets for American distilled alcohol at the same time. The Buy Canadian dimension of the boycott extends beyond travel and alcohol into general consumer goods. The Wikipedia documentation of the boycott covers its spread across retail purchasing, where Canadian consumers began actively selecting Canadian-made or non-American products across product categories ranging from clothing and household goods to vehicles and electronics. The VIN number education campaign identifying that vehicles starting with the digit 2 are Canadian assembled spread through Canadian social media and news coverage during 2025, with consumers using vehicle identification numbers to verify whether a car purchase would support Canadian manufacturing. American automobile market share in Canada fell to approximately 36%, a historic low during the period when the boycott was most active. The American Travel Association and hotel industry groups in border states published repeated statements in 2025 urging policymakers to consider the impact of the bilateral trade conflict on American hospitality sector. Employment. Those statements represent a domestic American constituency: hotels, restaurants, tour operators, transportation companies whose economic interests align more closely with Canadian tourist arrival volumes than with the trade policies that reduce those arrivals. The American hospitality industry's political engagement with the trade dispute is not advocacy for Canadian interests. It is advocacy for American hospitality, worker employment, American hotel revenue, and American small business viability in communities whose local economies depend on Canadian visitor spending. The consumer-driven nature of the boycott is what makes it both powerful and difficult for the American side to address through conventional trade policy responses. A government can negotiate tariff schedules, challenge trade barriers at the WTO, and apply diplomatic pressure on official policies. None of those tools address individual Canadians choosing to vacation in Portugal instead of Florida, buying Canadian whiskey instead of Jack Daniels, or routing their household shopping away from American brands and toward Canadian alternatives. The aggregate commercial impact of those individual decisions measured in billions of dollars of lost American tourism revenue, lost American alcohol export revenue, and lost American retail market share in Canada is real, documented, and continuing. Canada's tourism agencies reported their strongest domestic travel numbers in years during the summer of 2025 as Canadians redirected vacation spending that would previously have gone to American destinations.